Okay, so I've done day one of trying to get better at chess, trying to get to 24-24, and I played a lot of games. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look over the openings of each games. This is the part where I'm going to try to get better, and I'm going to input those games into a separate study, which you cannot see because I am bad at screen organizing. And I'm going to look at the openings and try to figure out improvements on each line I played. So I'm going to turn on the computer here. I think I should lower it to 3 lines. I've heard it calculates better if you do 3 lines at a time rather than 5. I usually have it set to 5, but set it to 3. And we're going to look at the openings I played, and I'm going to try to improve on them if where there's flaws. And I'm also going to focus not just on here's where I made a mistake, but here's a plan in the resulting positions. So for instance, I might have played the opening well. Say I equalize comfortably as black, I'm slightly better, but I end up in a kind of aimless position. What I'm going to do is in my study, I'm going to get to a position, I'm going to input an improved move on what I played, and then I'm also going to say, here is a plan from that position. And the plan could be, here is the pawn break to aim for. It could be, here is a useful piece repositioning scheme. It could be, here is a weak square to target, right? It doesn't have to be, here is the entirety of what I do over the next 15 moves, but some idea in the position. So here I played d5 and I have a large advantage, and after knight b8, e4, I am +3. This is a line I'm never really going to see. b6 is a weird move, and I obtained a huge advantage that I should be able to play effectively for advantage. I do not think this is a very important game to look at, so I'm going to skip that one and move on to the next one. Slightly more important to focus on losses than wins, but I'm not too invested either way. I think looking at all games is pretty useful. I'm going to switch over. I'm going to make sure I'm in the master's database. We're going to turn on the computer. Here I played e6 and I played bishop d6. They retreated and I went for c5 immediately. Knight f6 first is also fine. I don't have a problem with this move order, but maybe I should insert knight f6 before playing queen c7. So that's something to note. Even with knight f6, I'm still going to play a queen c7, knight d7 idea, as you've seen if you've watched the video of me playing. But maybe knight f6 first is useful, gets a little control over e4, make sure I can castle if needed. Seems a useful move to insert. I tend to delay it, but I probably should insert it. I think the reason I delay it is because there are lines here where white gets this really kind of quick attack, and I like going on the queen side first. For instance, you'll notice knight f6 is not a very popular move here, and after knight f6, white's percentage is better, though not with the plan I was saying. But you'll see black tends to go queenside here, or play knight e7, where the knight has a nice square on f5 if wanted. So there's reasons not to commit to knight f6, but those reasons I think are entirely when they've played bishop f4 and kept the bishop there, which is pretty rare. And when they play bishop g3, I should play knight f6. So in my chapter, I'm going to make a chapter anti-London system. You can't see this part, sadly, but actually, let's make it so you can. So here now you can see my study. I made anti-London system, and we have d4, d5, bishop f4, e6, e3, bishop d6, bishop g3. I'm going to put in knight f6, and I'm going to add the note, only delay knight f6 when they keep the bishop on f4 to keep open ideas like knight e7 f5 or knight e7 g6. So the real idea here is to improve retention, right? So I'm looking at these openings, I'm going to see where I should improve. But I think seeing something once does not give you a good chance to remember it the next time. It's really useful to see things a second time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to both say where I think the better move is and write something down and hope that that gives me 2 versions. And then later I'm going to look at this again, because I really think for most people learning, you look at something once, the odds of it sticking are just not so good. And you look at something a second time, and suddenly you have this much better chance to retain the information, to be able to see it in a comparable position. So Then there was the question of how to deal with this stone wall. And this is an interesting point. Knight e7, it might be a better square, than now it's going back and forth. And it really wants me to play queen b6 at some point. It liked it a little more earlier, say queen c2, and then it wants me to take on e5, and if they retake the standard way, knight g4. So they have these double problems, and of course if they defend this way, I assume I can take on e3, and then take on b2. I cannot, in fact. Or it thinks white is okay there. It's going back and forth, but it thinks even better was just to retreat the knight or play f5, which can be a useful move in these lines. So okay, there's some tactical ideas with queen b6 pressuring b3, b2, but I'm mostly concerned with, I learned I want to play knight f6 before c5 if they've done this stuff with bishop g3 rather than kept the bishop on f4. I don't need to delay knight f6. There's not advantage in doing so. So we move on to a third game. Here we had a symmetrical English. So I'm going to input in my opening tabs in the symmetrical English. They played g6 here. I played knight f3. I can also play g3. But I've been going for d4 against the symmetrical English. So I'm going to stick with that for the moment. And they played knight c6. Now, as we see here, knight c6 is not really a move played, but it does get played in bullet, so we should know what to do against it. d5. And how did the game continue? Knight e5. And I went knight d2. Now, knight d2 is probably not best. So, So it was showing knight d2 pretty positively, but knight takes e5 makes more sense, I think. Because we're going to play e4, and if we press the X button, we see the threat. You can see f4 is coming up pretty high. We're going to play f4, for instance, if they play d6. I think we already have time and should insert, I think, f4, bishop g7. The bishop comes to d4. I probably play bishop d3 and then knight e2. So bishop g7, bishop d3. I'm going to castle. I have this good pawn storm ready. So I think the key is this position where I get e4, I get f4, and white has a very nice advantage against knight e5. So I'm going to try to input the evaluation. White is better. And in the other line, I'm going to not put an evaluation in yet because it was only 4 moves in. And hopefully we'll get more games in that line and the line will go deeper. But I also want to try to give evaluations at the end of lines. So we're going to say f4 here, and that is an improvement on my knight d2. The knight d2 is a reasonable move, and I may repeat it the next time I see it because I thought it was interesting. We move on to the next game. So we go back to the start, g3, d5. I'm not too concerned what I'm doing against King's Indian attacks right now, so I'm going to skip this one, though, of course, if I face a lot of King's Indian attacks, I do have to focus on that. But focusing right now on kind of my main lines, c4 with white, and what I'm doing against e4 and d4 with black. So here we get a reverse closed Sicilian. I will input the first set of moves. So we're going to make a new chapter, reverse closed. We're going to put it in the English section because we're white here. And here I'm going to put in the move order with e5 because they transpose. Knight c6, g3, g6, g2, bishop g7, d3, d6, e4. And here in this game they played knight e7. They did a different move order, but this is the standard move order, knight g2, castles. And here I castled, and they played h6. So this is going to be sort of the early position. And I went for a quick knight d5, I think. I often do. Yeah. So one idea here is black wants to push f5, f4. And knight d5 gets good control over the f4 square. If they trade for it, we're going to get this c-file and potential pressure against c7. And their knight doesn't have a great square to go to. After my knight is traded, their knight, if it comes here, the only forward square, I'm going to weaken their pawn structure. They really want to be able to occupy d4 with pieces, and usually when black plays an early piece to d4, if white can trade and force them to occupy it with a pawn, that is a favorable exchange for white. So knight d5, and we can see quite good players. I like Alexander Delchev, Irina Krush is very good, have played this way. And so I feel good about that. They played f5. I played bishop e3. This looks like standard move here. They played g5. And this was the point where we have an interesting question. I went with f4, which looks good. And they played knight g6, and then I went for ef5 and d4, which, as I said, was perhaps a little suspicious. So knight g6 is a mistake, so we're going to identify that as a mistake. And the correct punish is fg5, hg5. If f4, I can just take it. Or I can insert gh6 and then take it. hg5, ef5. Why am I not seeing the punish yet? Bishop f5, and then knight ec3, and I'm just winning? Why am I winning? I'm not threatening rook f5 and knight e7. Is just the knights on e4 and d5 too strong? Queen d2 is coming? Why is this a win? Queen h5 is coming. Huh. So if they make some normal move, so I'm going to insert winning, much to my surprise. So if knight e7, that looks like a normal move, they hang g5. Yeah, okay. So they can't do it that way. Knight d4, I'm trying to get in c6 for them. Then we come with queen h5. And I guess the threat's just to take on g5. Bishop e4, it's interesting it pops out bishop e4 as well as knight e4. Why is this winning so quickly? I'm just going to make some moves. c6. Bishop d4, ed4, rook f5. I'm just threatening to remove the defender of g6. Why wasn't I seeing this? So if black makes a waiting move like rook f7, I'm just playing rook f5, I think. Yeah. And if they make a waiting move like queen d7 that defends f5 again, I can take on c7 because their queen's overworked. With the bishop coming to d5 as well. That's very strong. Yeah. Bishop d5, bishop e6, queen g6. Yeah, that's very strong. Okay, so this position has a lot in the air. And it is a winning position for white. So that's very interesting that after g5, I should just take on g5, and I'm winning here. All right, and we could put a note here saying queen h5 is coming, attacks g5, also threatens rook x f5 and queen x g6, also threatens knight takes c7 and bishop d5 check ideas. So just that when I look through these notes again, I'll see, oh, those are a bunch of ideas in this position. That's why it's so strong. All right, we move on to the next game. Go back to the start. Played an e6 move order, not sure why. We got our triangle system, and they played e4. So I'm going to make the chapter triangle system early e4. Because the main line is with e3, and we'll get to that. But I think it is, I need to get better at defending the positions when they play e4. I know they're not great. Like, if we look at this position, right, the computer immediately says black is a little better. And if you look at the results in master games, you'll see black outscores white. This is a good position for black. But we do have to be careful here. So here white played bishop e2, which seems like the main move. And I played bishop b7, castles, and then I took on c3. So bishop b7, the main move. The idea is they're not yet threatening my pawn as long as their knight's pinned. And when they do threaten the pawn, I want to play a6, but I don't want the a6 pawn to be pinned, because at this point I can't take it back, so bishop b7 is a useful move. I notice knight f6 has been played a lot with good success. I wonder... I guess I always have time to take on c3. So for instance, if knight f6, castles, a6, ab5, bishop c3, bc3, cb5, they don't have anything else that can take on b5, so I'm not walking into a pin. So I'm going to put in bishop b7, but leave a note, knight f6 may be better. But you'll notice it was thinking knight f6 was better the prior move, Like, at this point in time, it was thinking go knight f6 and giving black an advantage. But as soon as you put in bishop b7, it moves towards white. And as soon as you put in knight f6, it moves towards white as well. So not so clear. My opponent castled. I took on c3 and then played a6. So I can play a6 immediately. Right. So b7 is a8 is defended, so I'm not walking into pins. I don't have to give up the bishop immediately. I think one really important thing to watch out for in general in these triangles is white plays e5, knight e4, and thinks about d6. And you might think, okay, well, I can get rid of the knight. The problem is the other knight can come to e4 as well, and then I have this huge problem on d6. And so while I do often am happy to trade the bishop for a knight if that knight could come to d6, they have two knights that could potentially do so, and it can be tricky to defend. But the point is here, I should play a6, don't need to take on c3 yet. I would like to keep my bishop alive if I can. All right, so we improved on that game, and we move on to another English. So here we have an exchange QGD. So that deserves a new chapter. We're learning here, right? I think this is useful. So I get it through the move order c4, e6. Of course, if they play d5, I take, and it's more like a Scandinavian. I think we'll talk about that in a bit. d4. Now, c6 is a very good move. The point is, if they play knight f6, I can head into a normal QGD exchange. And if they play bishop e7, I can play bishop f4. But if they play c6, both moves are kind of defanged, right? I can't play bishop g5 because it's hanging, much like it would be after bishop e7. And if I play bishop f4, they can immediately respond with bishop d6 and trade off this bishop, which tends to be something black wants to do. If you compare to bishop e7, now if I go bishop f4, bishop d6 loses a tempo. And weirdly, bishop d6 is still something black plays quite a lot there. So c6 is basically a full tempo up over a position black is completely fine. So here we went bishop f4, which is the main move, and they went bishop e7, bishop d6 more common, bishop f5 also a reasonable move. I played e3, which looks like white does very well. Now if they go bishop f5, standard ideas are queen b3 to hit the pawn, or if my bishop is here, queen f3 can hit the bishop in an annoying way. If they don't have bishop e7 yet and do have bishop f5, say they have a knight f6, bishop's back on f8, bishop f5, and my bishop's on g5, I play queen f3, they move the bishop, and I can double their pawns. So those are the moves that come to mind against bishop f5. But let's continue with how the game went. Knight f6, bishop d3. You'll notice white's scoring very well here. Castles, and I went knight e2. And I suspect that's not right. Yeah, so let's start with queen c2. That seems to be what good players do, and queen c2 is a useful move to have played. So let's say we continue the same way. Queen c2, rook e8, and yeah, so it looks like knight f3 and knight g2 are both playable. I've been playing with knight e2 lines, so let's be consistent here and go knight e2. Then queen c2, we transposed, knight d7, and I played h3, because I've been doing h3 lines. Looks like h3 is a very reasonable way to play. They played knight f8, and I played g4. It appears I am consistent with some good players, like Sasakiran. He's played this a lot. Li Chao, who's played a bunch of games I like, and sometimes plays the Lowenthal, which I wrote a course on. Now, the computer prefers other moves, but let's stick with it. Knight g6, bishop g3, bishop d6, and I castled queenside. This is queenside. Following a master level game, they took. I'm going to take back knight, and let's say white is better. White is much farther along in their kingside attack than black is. Okay, feel pretty good about that one. Think I thus played the opening pretty reasonably. I hope I ended up winning this one. That's not the way to check. I did end up winning this one. Nice. Okay. Still all in games. Gonna just be doing games from today. So this was a b3. Not going to worry too much about hypermodern stuff at the moment. I don't specifically have a line I'm focusing on against them, so there's not much to check. So, what's this called? I guess this counts as a symmetrical with e6. So symmetric. We'll just put that in the symmetrical English chapter. And say knight c3. Oops. Knight f6. I wouldn't actually get to it from this move order because I play knight f3 here. So maybe we should put it in knight f6, e6 lines. Yeah. I think that will be better organizationally. So c4, oops. c4, knight f6, knight c3, e6. I play e4 here. And c5 and d5 are the main moves. They play c5. I kick the knight. Knight has to go back. Knight f3. Now knight c6 I'm a bit prepared against, but d6. ed6. The computer also likes d4 there, but bishop d6, d4. So this was all played. And I took queen, which is probably not great, but it does hit g7. All right, both takes are playable, but knight d4 looks better. And here, I assume my threat's knight b5. Yeah. That's very strong, actually. Because I hit the bishop twice, and if the bishop moves to e7, I take. Now, if the king takes, I get really good pressure on c7. If the bishop takes, I already have knight d6 check, and the king can't defend both f7 and c8. So black basically has to play e6. So I'm going to put in a note, huge threat, knight db5. So black basically has to play a6. And then white continues bishop e2. Is bishop coming here? Then it can be a little annoying. Yeah, there could be a little something here. So bishop e2, knight f6, castles, and I'm assuming, okay, not bishop e3 yet, or bishop f3 yet. Bishop e2, queen c7 because knight c6 immediately ruins their pawns. Got to save the pawn. h3. Now if they go knight c6. Knight c6. So queen c6, bishop f3 just loses time, and white's got a slightly better position. All right. And the bishop comes to f3. And I should put the valuation after a move of mine, because it's useful to see the next move of you, not to feel lost in the position like, okay, I know after that move I'm better, but what's the next move? You want to put the eval after a move of your color playing it. All right. So I lost that one because I blundered an exchange. Ooh, this one was a disaster. Forget how it came about. Right, weird opening. Not going to focus on that one. Of course, not focusing on weird openings if they show up a lot is a waste of time. Is like, bad use of stuff. But if you're not going to see an opening very often, like you obviously want to spend more of your time on openings you see. So here we have an exchange QGD. So we're going to go to our exchange QGD chapter. Instead of c6, they played knight f6, which I think is not as good a move because it allows me to get back into the main lines. Bishop e7, e3, castles, bishop d3. This is all standard stuff. Bishop g4, queen c2. So bishop g4 is an odd move. You'll see it's not one of the four most common moves. And apparently I should block it. So I assumed queen c2 is a useful thing. But in fact, queen c2 is a move I generally want to make, but they're going to be able to counter that diagonal. So maybe knight g2, and they want them to take. So let's say they continued kind of a normal move, c6. What's my big point? So queen c2, bishop h5, I have... Oh, I just can take on f6, obviously, yeah. So queen c2, I guess, doesn't quite give them time. Because if they play h6, then suddenly their bishop can't come back to g6 because it only has one defender. So they often have to take on e2. So if h6... I'm actually supposed to just take... I guess because this bishop doesn't have a home, I'm never really giving up the 2 bishops, and I'm happy to trade this, but I can keep this. And now my threat, I assume, is... Okay, it's castles, but f3 could come, or h3 maybe. So if, like, knight bd7, I can play f3. Wow, rook e8's apparently scary, but, like, f3, and the bishop doesn't really have squares, because bishop h5, it's never really coming back to g6. If it comes to e6, it gets pestered by knight f4. So they really often have to trade kind of on e2. How do I want to take back? Seems to not really matter. And this is about equal, but I do have the 2 bishops for kind of nothing. Yeah, I don't think it really matters which way I take back. Say bishop. Alright, so our big note here... Do we have anything better than queen c2? So queen b3, queen b6, probably a little better, but not much. Queen c2 there, interesting. Is this position better than the previous? Because I've induced queen b6, and otherwise it is exactly the same. So why is this position better? Is the queen offsides on b6? It easily could be. If you look at the pawns, white's pawns go queenside, and often play b4, b5, playing where the pawns head. Black's head towards the king side, and the queen is often comes over and helps attack. So maybe queen b3 is an interesting subtlety. Probably examine this one more later. I'm gonna put some symbol to, like, Okay, I'll come back to that line later. Curious version of that opening. Okay, almost out of time for this. So here we have the symmetrical Maroczy. So what did I put here? All right, so I'll put it in this chapter. I'm going to put Maroczy in parentheses because that's clearly what I'm playing for with these d4 breaks. Here they took, I took, and they played knight c6. I played knight c2. Again, I think bishop c3 is the critical line. We'll go over it when we get to a game where they played it. Knight f6. So e4 is the main move. I do know that. I've always played g3. We're going to stick with g3 for now. Castles, bishop g2. d6, castles. Because this knight c2, g3 line is kind of a pet line, but I don't actually do that well with it, so not a very good pet line. Bishop d7, b3, a6, bishop b2, queen c8. So normally I play knight e3 and queen d2 to make sure b2 is defended before going for knight d5. Knight a4 is interesting. So is knight d5 just in general, because with their queen on c8 it's a little awkward. I played rook e1, which is not a good move, though it's alright. But okay, knight d5, knight takes, bishop g7. There's no point of them throwing in knight e3 or knight c3, so king g7. cd5, knight moves, rook c1. Now they don't have time for bishop h3, because... Do I play knight d4? Knight e3, queen d7. Then take, I have g4 defended, and I can invade. That's a cute line. And so they kind of have to move out of the way. Queen c3 is a hard move to find. This position looks quite nice to me for white. So I'll say white's slightly better and give that variation. So this queen c8 idea, not great. That was that game. Alright. Caro-Kann against knight d2. So I have no idea what to do here. So I'm going to make a new chapter as black. I can't really test what I did because what I did makes no sense. So we're going to say KIA, work on this. Because I need some line to start with. I can't just like check move 3 because I'll see what's a better move 3, like e5 is a better move, whatever, but I won't know how I'm supposed to follow it up. So I have to come up with, like, here is my sort of line first, and then I can start checking how it does. So that is a line I need to come back to and work on. Because, like, e5, like, if we go to analysis board, like, everyone plays e5 here. But I need to know how I'm supposed to follow it up, and I'll do that work on my own, hopefully. Alright, here's a game where I clocked up many rooks. So this is the Anglo-Scandinavian. Not a very important line to mention because it's bad. Just very bad for black. But even if a line is terrible for black, like immediately plus 0.8 kind of thing, like just white has an enormous position, I'm going to play e4. I think actually it's worth putting a little thought into this. So one thing to note that I think is interesting is if we compare it to a Scandinavian, the big problem with the Scandinavian, and the reason it's not just like a terrible opening, is white c-pawn is blocked. If white could play c4 and d4, they'd just have this phenomenal position. But the c-pawn is blocked, and that gives black just enough to be okay. Why is my clicking not? There we go. Here, we have an even better Scandinavian, right? Because we have traded a wing pawn for a central pawn, and we still have both our central pawns. But I think, okay, c6 is a bad move. And I'm just going to play knight f3 and e4, some order, and I went bishop c4. I guess not as good, but, you know, white's better. But I think more interesting, okay, the computer likes e5 for them, but I think more interesting in general is, say, like knight f6, say knight f3, e6, e4, c5. Now, I don't know if they have to play c5 immediately, but I think it's kind of an interesting question, because if you look at the pawns, if white plays d5, black's going to take it, and white gets an isolated pawn. So we've gone from this lovely center to having an isolated pawn, which we might have the activity to justify, but is going to take some effort to justify. If we take the pawn, we end up in an endgame with symmetrical pawn structures, right? We're each going to have these 4 pawns on the king side and these 2 pawns on the queen side. And so that's very unappealing too. We could also play something like e5 and try to get like the knight out of the way and then take on c5. We won't get the endgame, but we're still going to have this symmetrical pawn structure where it can be hard to show advantage. And if we let them take, we're going to get that same pawn structure, though maybe with a little more piece activity. So I do like the look of a move like bishop f4, just keeping stuff on the board. And yeah, so if we let them take or we take, symmetrical pawn structure. If we play d5, we end up with this isolated pawn. So I guess we could try e5 here. So maybe we don't. So maybe that's actually a nice version of this. So we play d5 and then e5. If d4, interesting that it likes bishop c4. Idea is if they take, we take on f7 and can try to pick up their queen. Ooh, bishop c4 is a very nice move. That's very interesting. Okay, so we're finding some ideas here. But I think the key for white is how to deal with this kind of c5 push. And I think this is a nice way to do it. I'd leave a note, but I want to check back to this after. Right. Almost out of time, so look at 1 or 2 more. So here we get Caro-Kann, main line. Except they're going to play knight g3. So Caro-Kann, main line, early knight g3. I'm going to consider main line when white plays d4 and knight c3 or knight d2, because they transpose. Play knight f6, they go knight g3. And I played h5, as is, I think, best. They played h4. I played bishop g4, I believe. Yep. They played knight f3. It's not best. Interesting. So the only move played here was taking. I played e6, which looks better. Bishop e2, bishop d6. It wants queen c7 first. The only master game has bishop d6. You'll notice the queen c7 line, the moves are played next to each other anyway. So I don't feel bad about that. Castles, queen c7. I think this might end up just being a good game. They played knight h1. And I took on f3, hoping for the mate. But also, if they have to play gf3, that is, of course, hideous. And they play bishop f3, and I checkmated them. I think we can say that is a good game. And we will look at one more. So we've made it through FM Shooter 96, and I did play a lot more games today. So maybe I'll make a second recap video. Ooh, played a lot. It's easier if you look through them at the time. So where were we? We were at FM Shooter, yep, here. And so we got another QGD exchange, and this time with E3. Sorry, with Bishop B4. Key difference here. So they allowed, they played Knight F6, which we're going to put as the main line now that we have more games in it. Played Bishop G5, and they played Bishop B4. So we sort of have a Rogozin. We've already exchanged C and D pawn, which is the main line against the Rogozin. So yeah, we're just in a main line Rogozin. E3, H6, and they went for G5, which when I prepared the Rogozin was also my idea, was to always go for G5. Yeah, I've completely forgotten what I prepared against it. And Knight E4, I should not play Knight E2. Yeah, it did look like kind of a foolish move. So the main move here is Queen B3, and they can play C5 or Knight C6. I'll have to get a game with Queen B3 and see how it goes. The Rogozin's too big a thing to just explore. But I should start with Queen B3, and I should check, like, let's say they castle. I know that's not, like, a move that helps put pressure. Okay, well, they have to defend the bishop. Okay. I just wanted to make a passing move for them. So, like, A5. Like, how do I develop? Bishop D3 and Knight E2? That looks right. Okay, Bishop D3 and Knight E2. Okay, that's good to know. So I'll put in a thing, Bishop D3, Knight E2, so I have that note. And, all right, one more. Ooh, this one went terribly. So we had a triangle, and they played E3. So we have a triangle, and we're actually going to get the main line this time. Triangle system, main line. We're going to put that next to triangle system early E4. D4, D5, C4, E6, say Knight F3 first, C6, Knight C3, takes E3, B5, A4, Bishop B4, Bishop D2. We did look at this game a bit because I stopped and wanted to look at it. So hopefully I remember. So I play A5, they take, I take, B3, Bishop B7 defends the rook on A8, Knight F6. And I believe this was the one where they played this early Queen C2 idea. Did they castle first? No, they did not. Which was important. I castled, they played E4. And the big idea here was Knight H5. We're going to give an exclamation mark to. We're going to say black is better. And we're going to say... White's king in the center makes F5 a very strong break. Knight F4 is hard for them to stop and annoying for them to deal with the queen on C2. And we still have E5 in the air. So one question. Against Queen C2 in general, like if they had castled, obviously if they haven't played E4 yet, but if they castle, we can take on F3. That's a good point. And if they play E4, we have this Knight H5 idea. So I guess the only other move C5. And against C5, we generally just block the pawns advancing. And now if Bishop C6, do we still have, or E4, we don't still have H5, Knight H5. They can castle, and now their bishop has room to move. So this is not as strong. So instead, when we don't have a good move, we don't have E5 because of D5, I assume. Or because it just castles. But unclear how bad that is, but apparently just castles. But we should just work on our queenside play. So A4. The bishop on C6 is a good supporter of the advance. Yeah, I forget about bishop C6s. So I'm going to give bishop C6 an exclamation mark. Because it's a move I forget. Put the bishop in front of the C pawn. Prepare E4. Okay, So I think we've gone through a lot here. Maybe I'll do another recap video later. But I think I've learned a few things. If we go through, in the reverse closed, we saw this FG5 idea with knight ec3 just as a winning follow-up. In the we saw this take on e5, e4, f4 idea if they play knight e5 when their knight's chased. In the knight f6, e6 line, we take back knight and we threaten this really big knight db5 thing. And if that doesn't happen, we play bishop e3, bishop e2, get the bishop to f3, and that's quite strong. Exchange QGDs, less clear what we were finding. In the anti-London learning, I do want to play knight f6 if they've moved their bishop off f4. In the triangle system, did not need to rip on c3. We can play a6 and keep the pawn solid. In the main line, this knight h5 idea is really neat, and especially with f5 coming. And in the Caro-Kann with this early knight g3, we actually did great. But I do have a big question there, which is if they don't play h4, if they play knight f3, what's the most precise punish? I've been playing h4, h3, and not getting much. So if bishop g4, can they just play h3? Oh, it thinks I just win the d4 pawn. Right, so bishop g4 threatens to win a pawn. And if bishop f3, gf3, this looks fantastic. And if they, say, play bishop e2, then h4, and the knight's pushed back to f1, but the knight comes out to e3. Is this so much better than h4 knight e2? Ooh, so h3 is actually not a great pawn to have there in this line. So bishop g4, they don't want to allow doubled pawns, so they move the knight. But the knight doesn't have a great square. That's interesting. Yeah, the knight does not have a great home. So, okay, so my big improvement in this line should be I am playing bishop g4. I am not rushing to play h3. So that's going to be my idea here as I play bishop g4, e6. I don't rush to play h3. All right. So that's my first review of the first day of my attempt to run up to 2400. Cheers.